Hello, I'm Maddie, and this is Grief Liberation Conversations in Community. Welcome back. I appreciate you being here. And today I've got a guest named Sam. Hello, Sam. What are your pronouns?
Maddie, my pronouns are he, him.
Thank you. My pronouns are they, them. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm really excited and honored to be on with you today. Yeah, a little bit about me. I think where I like to begin is where I'm at in the world. So I am living on the ancestral homelands of the Ohlone Ramaytush peoples, which is now called San Francisco. And yeah, a bit about my background. I am a gay cis man of color. I have ancestral roots that are both colonizer and colonized roots from Mexico with Spanish mixed in there and indigenous roots. And on my paternal side, my dad is from Venezuela, which is also a mix of, yeah, Latino, indigenous, Spanish as well. So kind of a mix. And yeah, I like to identify as someone who is fighting for collective liberation and am really passionate about doing work in communities towards bringing about liberation, and also really been working towards decolonizing my body, my mind, my being, spirit, soul, alongside co-conspirators who are also on that journey. I am recently married to my husband Finn, and we have two beautiful and amazing and energetic and a handful of two dogs. One is a Doberman named Esau, and the other is a pit bull mix named Blaze.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate you very much. Thank you for that. And now that the audience knows you a little bit more, I think before we get started, I'd like to do a collective breath, and then I'll ask you some questions. So, for listeners who need a refresher, physiological sigh is the technique that I use here, and that is a deep inhale that fills the lungs, inhale quickly, and then a sip of air just after, hold for 4, and then slowly breathe out for 6 to 8 counts. So let's try that. All right. How do you feel?
Or just in my body and really slowed down a bit.
Yeah, thank you. So let's get started. I'm going to ask first, what is your definition of liberation?
Oh, it's such a big question.
Mm.
My definition of liberation. Yeah, I'm reminded of this reminder that I have on my phone every day at noon. It says, "What is your theory of change?" And I think in that reminder, in that question, is part of what I connect to liberation. I think about liberation as a feeling, experience, something that is within all of us individually, collectively, is something that is dependent on where where we're positioned in the world. Yeah, I think as I see liberation, I think about the current state of the world. I think about the body I'm in, being a cis man of color, also being queer, and the different intersecting marginalized identities that I hold, and also the privileges that I hold, and the experiences that I've lived through, continue to live through, and the communities that I've grown up in and navigated. Yeah, so I think about how do I really liberate myself from oppressive ways of thinking, of imagining, and yeah, just my imagination and our imagination collectively, individually, are what I think are a key and a pathway to liberation. It's like, what can we imagine as an otherwise? What can we imagine as change, as coming together versus being in oppositional positions to one another, and really collectively how we are aware of how we're interconnected, how all things are interconnected without flattening or erasing our differences, but really seeing how we can really support each other in liberating ourselves and one another.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. And, thinking about how it intersects with grief, like, I think there's so much people have cut themselves off from within their own like experience in order to feel acceptance, especially in white culture and in Western culture, and to reach some sort of place within the self. I wonder what your thoughts on liberation and grief, like, are they part of the same kind of capsule, if you will? Is it more of like a spectrum? Like, where do you think grief and liberation kind of fit in?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question. As I think about that and think about my experiences, I think grief often has been kind of, at least the way that I've grown up, has been something that kind of is compartmentalized or kind of put in certain boxes, whether that's like the loss of a loved one, and for specific experiences, and almost like time frames. Like, here's how much time you have to grieve, and then it's time to go back to living. And as I've grown up and become more aware of my own relationship to grief, I think making space to be with it, not only on my own, but with others who can hold me in that. Grief has been such a gift. And yeah, I think about how it connects to liberation. And I think in Western colonial culture, you kind of are given just short periods of time to have a process that is ongoing, and then expected to go back to work and yeah, keep living and moving on. And I don't think grief works that way. And I think that's a way in which we kind of get pulled into oppressive systems or structures that take away from liberation. So I think of grief as if we give ourselves the space and time that we need and are doing that in community, we're actually creating a liberatory praxis or practice and pathway. You know, it's maybe radical to some. I think there's cultures around the world that really have such a beautiful way of grieving and holding each other in that process and making the space that's needed, that they haven't been pulled into this way of being that we have grown up in here in the States. So yeah, they're very much connected in how I see it. And for true liberation, I think we have to be able to feel the full spectrum of emotions and make space for them and make space to connect over our shared experiences.
Totally. Yeah, when I think of Western culture, I think of how common it is to be fearful of the unknown, fearful of truth, fearful of other people, and there is a privilege in Western culture where many people can turn away from what's uncomfortable, and liberation requires to look at what is uncomfortable, to look at what other people are not seeing, both within themselves and in bigger spaces and bigger patterns that are happening. And I appreciate what you shared. Like I think you nailed it like on the head about all of that and how collectively liberation and grief do coexist. And there it's part of the same thing. We need to be able to experience all of our emotions. And if we are able to do that, there's a way that we can liberate ourselves. And if we can liberate ourselves, then we can step outside of ourselves and step into the world and see the world for what it is instead of all these projections and control and trying to feel safe. And I wonder, have you felt like you've had to perform masculinity? And is there grief with performing masculinity? Because I feel like that's part of liberation too, is like there's performance. We perform these different roles and like, yeah. So masculinity as a performance, I can see existing in the realm of grief, but I'm curious what your experience with that is.
Yes, I think I want to bring in some of the work that I've been working on in my program, in my community praxis work that I'm doing for my graduate program. And I'll begin with who kind of sparked something in me around looking at masculinity. And yeah, so Alok, the trans non-binary activist, poet, scholar, came into my orbit, I think at least 5, 6 years ago. And I recall coming across an article. It was an interview that they had done for Rough Cut Press, and they were talking about their one of their poetry books, and I think it's Your Wound, My Garden, something along those lines. And they were talking about this notion of suffocated grief in cis men, and how suffocated grief is something that comes from a body of work by Dr. Tashel Border, who did her research with Black youth around grief that has been disenfranchised, grief that hasn't really been given space to be felt and experienced. And simultaneously, they have been kind of pushed to be men, to keep going, to not allow themselves to really be or express that grief. So it comes out in ways that are perceived as aggressive or as just acting out. And in her work, she's really been able to identify that and support them in being able to express their grief and how that actually shifts their experience, because it's there's somebody who's willing to be like, yes, like you're hurting, you've lost someone in your life, like let's hear about it, let's make space for that, let's be with it and express it in whatever way that needs to come out without deeming anger as something that's bad. And it's something that's valid, and it's something that we all experience and need space to be felt and expressed. So pulling on her work, Alok talks about in this interview the potential connection of suffocated grief in cis men and the kind of from a cis man's experience of seeing a trans, a gender nonconforming, or gender expansive person as it putting them in touch with this suffocated grief in themselves, because they see this person who is expressing all of who they are, even though culturally it's not normative and in a lot of places not acceptable. And that what they're put in touch with is the grief in themselves that they haven't allowed themselves to fully express their spectrum of feelings or expressions or emotions that have wanted to be expressed but have been pushed down. So I'll speak to my own experience of this. I I know that growing up, I learned at a very young age that without even there being words, like I just from observing what socially acceptable is being a boy or being a man in this culture. And I learned the social codes of not to cry, to not express emotion, to kind of hold things in more, to act more masculine, and essentially like take on these different masks so that I would not stand out. I would not be under the gaze of those looking to spot anything outside of what was normal. And in that process, I also was realizing there's parts of me that really wanted to be expressed but didn't know how to be expressed, because I grew up in a culture, in a religion that basically told me I needed to be attracted to the opposite sex, which for what I was assigned at birth was the opposite is a woman, a girl. And I think what I realized as a little boy is there were parts of me that could really connect and relate to girls and women. Like I was a lot more emotionally sensitive. I also knew from a pretty young age that I was attracted to men. And in that experience, as I reflect on that and have really been sitting with that, it's like, what was I really wanting? And it was is wanting love and connection that I feel like I lost at a certain point. And then I started to kind of become othered. And then coming back to this experience of masculinity, I feel like now and growing into expressing more of who I am and how I identify, I think about being a gay man and how much that identity was it was such a big moment for me to finally be able to say this is who I am. And that was huge in my development, and I didn't have a lot of examples or models to look up to of what that could look like in a healthy expression. And I kind of had to piece things together based on, friendships, based on things that I saw online in movies, and a lot of the time, like, based on what masculinity is supposed to be like, based on our cultural norms. And in that experience, I realized that within the gay community, there's like this propping up of masculinity and this kind of misogyny against men who acted feminine. But then you also have these like roles that are kind of taken on within the gay community. And I know I'm generalizing, and I feel like there's more and more growth and expansion into expressions of sexuality within the gay community. I think the time that I was really coming into myself and yeah, like just kind of held on to kind of leaning into the more masculine side of things. And that, again, didn't really feel like it was fully allowing me to express all parts of myself. And I think as I say that, I realize like it was hard to be vulnerable. And it still is really hard to be vulnerable. But I've had the opportunity to be vulnerable with people in my life that's given me this sense of deeper connection because of that vulnerability. And I realize that we all have these quote unquote masculine and feminine energies within us, archetypes, if you want to call them that. And yeah, it's more of a spectrum, more of a fluid kind of experience that I am subscribed to now. And I also, yeah, I think about this question and notion of suffocated grief and masculinity and how trans and non-binary and gender expansive people might put me in touch and other men in touch with this grief of not fully expressing ourselves, and how what I'm perceiving and what I've been kind of feeling into more is like, why is there so much anger and so much targeting of trans gender nonconforming folks in our culture, in our country at this point in time? Like, what is that putting people in touch with that is so hard and unsettling? And yeah, I've really felt like it's important to examine how I carry transphobia because of the world, because of the transphobic nature of our world. Like, I think it's in a lot of people. I can carry transphobia and still be someone who identifies as an ally and as someone who wants to support the liberation and the humanity of trans and gender nonconforming people. And that doesn't, like, I say that because I think it's important to name how deeply ingrained it isn't within all of us. And it doesn't make us a bad person, but it's part of the work. It's looking at how we carry these systems of oppression because of the world that we live in. And on top of looking at transphobia, looking at misogyny, looking at homophobia that we've internalized as well, upholding patriarchy, and the intersection of transphobia and misogyny, trans misogyny. Yeah, it's just, to me, that's the work. It's like examine these things, talk about them, and really start to disrupt and dismantle these oppressive systems that we've taken on, and do that in community. So that's where I'm coming at this in my work, stemming from, wanting to work with men around connecting through touch and realizing we've grown up in a culture that has said that touch between men is not okay after a certain age because that's perceived as gay. And I think there's a lot of men who need and crave nourishing touch from another man that's not sexual within the gay community and beyond, whatever sexual orientation, identity one carries. So yeah, that's really kind of my take on what you asked.
Yeah, that was such a rich and thoughtful response, and I appreciate it very deeply. And I appreciate the nuance that you bring up, especially in bodies who are trying to do the work. There is still work we're doing within ourselves as we do the work outside of ourselves. So, even though I am trans and non-binary, I still hold transphobia within myself. I am disabled and I hold ableist ideas. And dismantling those are really, really difficult. And I can do that and still show up for other people in the community and still do the work that's required. And the work starts with the self. And the work that we do outside of ourself is just an extension from doing the work with the self. And so I appreciate you naming that. I think that's really important and a hard concept for some people to grasp when they're just overwhelmed with all the nuance and they see, oh, this is just another thing that I have to do, another rule that I have to follow. And it's like, if you looked at it from yourself instead of as like a task that you have to perform and really investigated within the self where all that is coming from, think people would be surprised with their responses instead of just shooting everything down that another person says and talking about like how difficult it is, like how difficult it is to get my pronouns correct and how difficult it is to get somebody's name correct when it's so easy for people to, for example, my sister's married, and when she changed her name, everybody immediately started using her new name. But it's been a battle for people to address me with my name. So it's not that the name is difficult, it's the baggage people attach to that. And that's not my work or the work for a trans or non-binary person who is giving their name and pronouns, that's not their work. It's the work of the people around them to respect them enough to do that work and say, okay, I will use this name going forward, and I believe you. And I think that's the thing when people who are stuck in this kind of performance of gender and of like religion and of basically white supremacist values. I think all of that is a performance to uphold whiteness as dominant culture. When we do that, we are disconnecting more and more from the self. And when we don't believe other people in their experience, that comes from somewhere. And maybe that comes from people not believing in our experience. Maybe that comes from just being so detached from the self from trauma or um, not being believed themselves at some point that they can no longer believe someone else in their experience. I appreciate the nuance that you bring up because I think that's really important to name. And I think you said that so beautifully.
Yeah, just really appreciate you sharing that really clear example of what is normalized, and it's so easy for a lot of people to just they went through this process there that's attached to their assigned sex at birth. They're in a heteronormative relationship and kind of upholding the status quo and what is, yeah, very patriarchal as well. And going against those norms, those cultural practices, for some people is really challenging. It's confronting because it puts them in a position to question their ideologies that they've just subscribed to because that's all they've known, or that's what they learn, that's what they see. And beginning to question, like, why is it I think the things that I think? And why is it that some people might not want to subscribe to that way of thinking or being? Is it can be really destabilizing. And I think it puts us in touch with that an instability in ourselves, that potential discomfort in ourselves when we see people who are different than ourselves, and this like kind of clamping down on what is socially acceptable and okay and normative becomes something super rigid. And it's like I have to hold on to this. Like if that goes, like what does that mean? What is my world going to be? And I think with people who get really defensive around, and I will name, I have a lot of defenses. They come up a lot within my relationships, some of my closest relationships. And I think it's really important to pause and be like, wow, like I'm really defensive in this moment. I'm taking this personally. I'm making it about myself. And that should be a big, like, pause. Look at this. Like, this is potentially like a place where I can start to, yeah, examine and look at, like, what is this putting me in touch with? Because it's putting us in touch with something deeper. The context of, you know, what led to that might be big, but there's something even deeper that it's actually that I think is being touched. And that's where I think the work is. That's where we can actually, that's what I think about like liberatory praxis. It's like looking at these defenses, looking at these pain points, and really seeing like what is there to learn from that, and what is it that we want to work towards, heal in ourselves? Like what is the need there? And how can we coming back to like breaking out of these normative ways of thinking, imagine and otherwise? And I think of my relationship with you, or our friendship, and just really appreciating what you helped me to see. Like I know there's things that I don't know and that I can't see because of the perspective that I'm coming from. And I'm willing to, yeah, to be in relationships where we hold each other accountable, we question, we also, yeah, stay open to maybe seeing things differently because we have different lived experiences, and even moments where, there's potential for conflict or misattuning or not fully understanding, and knowing that that's okay. And knowing that, again, that's an opportunity for growth and for learning and for deepening our connection.
Yeah. I appreciate you and all that you share there. And I mean, that sentiment is definitely mutual. I feel like I've learned so much from being in relationship with you and learning some things that I didn't see before because, again, of my positioning and my privileges and my biases that I didn't know exist, and even some that I did know, I just didn't know how to move from. And I think having curiosity in relationships with people and curiosity when it comes to working within ourselves and ultimately, like, on a larger scale in the world and in our society, I think that's the first step to kind of realizing just how connected we all are. We are all experiencing emotions in different ways. We all experience emotions. We all experience grief in some capacity, especially. And there's grief that I think a lot of people are so disconnected from because they're so disconnected within themselves. And if we can't be comfortable with uncomfortable things like our fears and the unknown, like death is a big unknown. That's something everybody is going to experience. In our culture, we pretend like it doesn't exist and we hide from it. We have this huge fear of it. That fear doesn't exist in all cultures. It exists here. But imagine how empowering it would be to say, okay, I'm afraid of dying. So let me research this. Let me learn about death. Let me learn what that process is. Let me learn what the process of dying is, what active dying looks like, how the body is going to take care of itself because the body knows how to die. Like learning that can be really empowering. And we step away from fear just a little bit and we believe other people and their experiences with death a little bit more because we got curious about that thing. And if we can't get curious with ourselves though, how do we expect to connect with other people if we're not curious? If we think that we know everything, which nobody knows everything, but the white supremacist value of like duality where things are right versus wrong or good versus evil, there is so much more nuance. And curiosity lets us explore that nuance and realize the the world is not black and white. It's very colorful. And there's so many experiences that we have yet to experience if we allow ourselves to be curious. And instead of thinking we have all the answers and like not paternalizing other people's experiences and just thinking, oh, if they only did this, because I know their experience so much better somehow. If we just believe people in their experiences, that curiosity would lead to a deepening of relationships. And I think of this like I keep hearing about the male loneliness epidemic, and it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating to hear about because the way that I keep hearing about it, it sounds like it's a problem with everyone else and their view of men, not what men are doing. And I'm not saying all men are experiencing loneliness and all men anything. Like, again, there's nuance. There's, even within this podcast, there's nuance. Nothing is binary. Everyone's going to have their own experience. And intersectionality is a big part of that. Like, the further away you get from this cis, straight, heterosexual, able bodied white man, the more a person has to like perform perfectionism in order to be accepted. And if white men specifically can't feel accepted, how is that going to ripple into everyone else? I think the male loneliness epidemic is an extension of grief. And I think it's something that is not being processed because of this performance of gender. But I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's so much that comes up as I hear what you shared. And I think something I wanted to name, like as I've been working with a small community of queer cis men of color and starting to talk about the performance of masculinity, internalized homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, internalizing patriarchy. I think that there's also, yeah, looking at racism and internalized racism and how white supremacy gets centered, and even like being in San Francisco, which it's interesting. When I first moved here in 2007, things were a lot different. The gay men that were out in the spaces that I was in, it was predominantly white gay men. And I remember there was a bar in the Castro called the Pendulum, which was known as like the black gay bar. And not that it was just black gay men, it was a mix, but it was a space for and by black gay men. And I remember it shut down, and just seeing less and less black gay men out, and looking at my own proximity to whiteness and assimilation to whiteness and how that really has impacted, and then looking at like who I'm attracted to and examining why is it that for so much of my life I've been predominantly attracted to white men, and starting to look at how that I think is connected to wanting to be closer to power, and how in our culture and in the world white men have held positions of power. And it's something that I think really requires us to, I say us, who do I mean by us? working with other queer men of color, like just realizing like we taken on white supremacy, and that being something that is seen as powerful, or for some of us, maybe I can't say this for all, but really starting to question, like, do they really hold power over, and is there a way in which we can do work in ourselves to like empower ourselves to not necessarily give our power over to them. I think for me, just how much of my life as being an out gay man has been centered around men. Like what I think about, who I hang out with, and really starting to question, like, why is my whole world centered around men, and realizing that there's so many other bodies and beings to be in a relationship with. Not to say that they haven't been part of my life, but really starting to open up to more relationships and intimacy with more than just men in my life has really just been such a powerful and profound experience. Like I really value and appreciate the relationships in my life that aren't just men, just the full spectrum. And I experience a level of depth and being met and being seen in ways that I've really been longing for. I think when I was hanging out with just gay men and that was my world, there was this very transactional way of being. Like, what can I get out of this? And being drawn to people a lot of the time based on my attraction to them or their attraction to me. And not to say attraction doesn't happen in all relationships. I think it does. But I do think that there's like this way of being within parts of the gay community where it's like, what can I get from this person? Whether it's access to their body or them wanting access to my body, and that being the currency, and the way that we're relating, and stepping outside of that kind of the confines of relating in that way for me has really opened me up to experiencing intimacy and connection, and being in relationship. Like I think about something that you were mentioning earlier around researching death. And I think how I kind of am coming at it is, and not to say you're not, but I want to name it in this way, is what is my relationship to death? What is my relationship to grief? And beyond just the human form, like the planet, the other beings that are in this world. I think there's so much to learn from nature and being in relationship with these processes, right? Like death and grief. Like there's so much to be experienced, because it, for me, is really what has given me such a deep gratitude for life. Because when we no longer have the physical presence of that other that was so deeply connected to us, that yeah, that experience of losing them but also appreciating what was had is such a gift in itself. And it actually, I don't think it ever goes away. Like I think about my brother's death, who he died in 2020. I have a relationship with him still, and it's with the parts of him that live in me. And that that is really like there was so much unsaid and unresolved in my relationship with him that it was like I think back to his funeral and speaking and having such a hard time because there was so much unprocessed at that moment that I had to rely on, other people's words to kind of express that experience for me. And in the years since then, there's just been so much healing because I've been able to be in relationship with the parts of him that live in me and see how so much of what I didn't want to see in myself, I projected onto him. And I've been in this process of being like, yeah, that's actually something I need to own and not just say, like, he was the bad one. He was the one that was problematic. And look at my own ways of being quote unquote bad or problematic. And I think one other thing that I wanted to name that's kind of coming up is complicity. Like, I think it's so easy to project things onto other people or even systems or ideologies, but really like turning that back on ourselves. Like, what are the ways that I'm actually complicit in these things? And that's where we can start to examine and disrupt and dismantle that and work towards liberation.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, I'm gonna think about some of that for a little bit. Yeah, there's just there's so much nuance to everybody's experience, and I think that's something that people kind of forget at times. Like, everyone is having a deeply human experience just as vivid as our own, and that kind of gives people their humanity. If we slow down and think, wow, things are not about me and my projections and how I see the world. There are other people on this planet. There are other ways of thinking and being and believing. And I think what like trans and non-binary and gender expansive people, what they represent is the unknown to so many because we are facing ourselves in a way that is uncomfortable for people. We represent other ways of living and being and experiencing life and joy. And that is scary for people who can't experience joy in their own experience. How dare people who are quote unquote outliers experience joy when I am suffering? Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate all that. And the last thing that came up for me that I wanted to say about that too is like when my best friend died in 2021, one of the things that really kept me going after was this idea that we are all energy. Energy doesn't just die, energy keeps going. And I like to think that because I was there as she passed, that I got some of that energy, some of her energy is in me, and that has led to so much growth because she was just a light in so many people's lives. But if we think of people as energy, people as nervous systems and energy that are worthy of their deeply rich experience, I think compassion kind of comes alongside that because we realize that, oh, I kind of am alone in my own experience. And I can find other people in community who are feeling something similar, but because I am having this deeply rich experience, other people probably are too.
Yeah, it makes me think about joy and how it's so easy to focus on the negative aspects of loss and not to negate that and not to bypass that, because I think it needs to be honored and validated and experienced. And I think about joy, not only the joyful experiences that I did share with my brother or the other people or beings that I have lost in my life. I also want to connect it to, like, in my experience of grief, like what can I connect to that brings me joy? And that's something that, like, I've been thinking about a lot because of the current state of the world and living under a fascist regime and witnessing the genocide of people in multiple parts of the world. And it's something that's been happening for years and years since and even before colonization. I I think about joy as something that I lean into when I know things feel really overwhelming and just so heavy that I can't get out from underneath that heaviness. And even if it's a glimmer of joy, I try to stay connected to that as well and hold it simultaneously because it keeps me connected to hope. And I think that that's so important. Like, if we lose hope, what are we gonna, you know, there's no imagining and otherwise, right? Like, there's no connection to our imagination. And there's the I'll say what's really brought me a lot of joy lately is the time that I spend with my dogs, just taking them to the beach and even playing with them when we get home and just petting them before we go to bed at night and just sharing that connection and touch. Like, it's something so simple but so it's relational, it's meaningful. They bring me so much joy, even though they take up a lot of my energy at times. And, like, I know that they love me and I love them. And I will also say that, there's some really amazing people in my life who've been there for me that bring me a lot of joy, you being one of them, to connect with and talk with, because just having the space to be held and witnessed or heard or really listened to can bring me a lot of joy as well, without it being like, oh, this is too much. Like, that to me, like, can really kind of cut off the connection. And not to say, like, spill everything. There's an exchange of energy, right? As we're sharing with each other. And as sensitive people, we do take things on and we hold that with each other. And I think that's where having a healthy relationship to setting our boundaries or being really honest with ourselves, like, do I have the capacity in this moment to go there without making the other person wrong or yourself wrong? But being able to name that is huge in relationship. And I think a lot of the time it's appreciated too when we mm, are able to, yeah, relate in those ways and communicate.
Yeah. And that feeling is mutual for sure. I appreciate the authenticity in our conversations that, I feel like I don't have to pretend to be somebody else. I can show up as I am and meet the moment with you. And that is always a gift because, especially because I like to go into depth at times. And it's a depth that some people are afraid of. And I just honor you meeting me there. It feels really good to be held and seen in the same way. So thank you.
Thank you, Maddie.
So I have one last question. What would you want listeners to take away from our conversation today?
Yeah, I think about my liberation studies and action class that I'm taking this quarter. And when we were going around the circle, we were asked, like, what do we want to get from this course? And I said I want to liberate myself. And I really, that's what I'm hoping for, is everyone listening to be able to liberate yourself more, and also just connect with your imagination in whatever ways you do, so that you can stay connected to hope, and really honor yourself and others' humanity, and really honor these experiences and feelings that are very much a part of life, whether that be grief, loss, anger, joy. So, yeah, liberate yourself, imagine, and otherwise see how we can stay in relationship to all the different aspects of our experience in life.
Thank you. Love that so much. And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and energy today. And I appreciate you listeners for showing up for another episode of Grief Liberation Conversations in Community. Remember to be kind to yourself, and we'll see you next time.